everyone. Today I'm going to just give you guys a little bit of an introduction about patterns. I've mentioned patterns before earlier, very early in fall semester when we talked about principles of design as pattern relates to rhythm and repetition. So a few of these initial images will be similar, if not identical, just to give you a refresher. And then I'm going to introduce you all to a few artists, maybe you know a couple of them, who utilize patterns within their work. So, general idea about pattern: a design in which shapes, lines, forms, or colors are repeated. The part that is repeated is called a motif. Patterns can be regular or irregular. So there can be variety within a pattern. So as we discussed in first semester, we see patterns and think of patterns often related to clothing and fabrics in our everyday life. A lot of patterns that are typically worn, people wear them. These are some examples of some of the better known patterns that are common within our world, in particular in the textile world. Different fabrics and patterns often have a cultural implication and can connote some sort of relationship to, in this case with Scottish clan tartans, they relate to your family and your lineage. These colors are very specific in the designs as well. Japanese textile, some motifs that usually involve nature that are being repeated with some variety. So the bottom right example is a really good one of a regular pattern where there's definitely some components repeated. It has a pattern-like feel to it, but it's not identical throughout the entire composition. Traditional African textile. These are often printed in a classical hand block sort of woodcut printed version. Sometimes they're painted, but they have traditional African images and symbolism. As I mentioned with various fabrics, I showed these to you guys earlier, but when you think about knitting or crocheting, there's an actual set of rules that create a pattern that have to be followed to complete this specific pattern. Quilting, obviously another great example. Different patterns, some irregular, some regular. These all tend to be pretty consistent. Tiles. Beautiful flooring that sometimes goes overlooked, but the repetition, even with some variety, creates really gorgeous patterning. So I wanted to talk about a few contemporary artists who are using patterns within their work. These artists range in age significantly and decently within their locations. So this title image is Takashi Murakami, which maybe some of you have seen his work. This is Takashi Murakami, being nice and goofy. This Japanese artist is well known for blurring the boundary between fine and commercial art, often categorized along historic and contemporary artists working with the tradition of pop art, like Andy Warhol, Damien Hirst, Jeff Koons. Murakami's work has achieved a widespread level of fame beyond the art world. His innovative, super flat aesthetic combines classical Japanese art with contemporary Japanese pop. Many people think of this as a fusion of high and low, which makes his work very engaging. So, exploring the links between traditional printmaking techniques and Japanese manga in post-war society. It is said that Murakami's work acts as a cultural barometer with subversive undertones. This is a nice goofy photo of him. He does these gigantic installations, as you can see, where pattern is placed not only within the artworks, but on the walls and on the floor as well. And this is a quote of his saying, "My aesthetic sense was formed at a young age by what surrounded me, the narrow residential spaces of Japan, and mental escapes from those spaces that took the forms of manga and anime." So you'll see here some repeated floral components in different sizes as well as in sculpture. Clark Rickert. Rickert's curiosity about dimensionality was informed in large part by R. Buckminster Fuller. He was part of the Drop City movement in the 60s and 70s, well, into the 70s and 80s. Fuller's designed for the geodesic dome, which Rickert and his fellow droppers, that's where Drop City comes from, followed in building in their living and working spaces in Drop City. So these were modular buildings that they lived in. His preoccupation with dimensionality defines the patternistic paintings he made as a member of the Boulder-based collective Crisscross in the 70s and 80s. Determined his subsequent turn towards pictorialism in the late 80s, 90s, and then came back. Pictorialism being like representational painting, but he came back to geometric abstraction in the early 2000s. So these are painted, hand-painted, acrylic paint. They're usually pretty large, like I believe this painting's about 4 feet on one side, square. Maybe a bit bigger, actually. Here's a print. This has a lot of movement in the way the colors are aligned. Your eye really bounces around, has a Rubik's Cube sort of feel to it. This is an image of an exhibition Clark had, I think a couple years ago, but it shows some of his work and the scale, so they're quite large. They must be closer to 5 or 6 feet. So you see on that left there a repeated pattern with some variety within the color application. Yayoi Kusama, I'm guessing some of you are familiar with her. I think I've shown images to all of her work before. I just love this dramatic photo of her in one of her installations. I believe that was for Prada. This is there we go. This is a little video of a time lapse of Kusama's work. So the room starts out completely white. She selects the objects and the orientation, and then visitors are welcome to place different colored dots anywhere they like. So people were adding to it during the entire exhibition run. And this is the final version. So here's an example of one of these rooms. What an amazing version of optical mixture. Here's another short video of Yayoi Kusama's work. She also is very famous for these infinity rooms. Maybe some of you guys have seen them before. So talk about an obsession for patterning, right? Kusama using these infinity rooms, using a mirror as a method to create an illusion of infinite repeated depth. So another artist who uses patterning in her work is Sascha Braunegg. I believe I've shown some of this work to you guys in the past. I love her paintings. So this is a painting, and she actually makes small models to develop these works. I thought I'd bring her up one more time. Canadian artist Sascha Braunegg paints abstract images that force the viewer to reconsider the figure in lieu of uncanny pattern. Often sculpting the form in her compositions out of clay prior to painting, Braunegg's works are all about surface, distorting simple squiggles or zigzags, patterns, into phantom objects or sensations. Inspired by Van Eyck and Holbein's portraits, the artist's optical illusions facilitate a potent human encounter, repetition and vibrant colors, translating the drama of shadow and texture. In a culture defined by connectivity, Braunegg reminds the viewer of the skin that they're in, blending in and drowning, becoming one and the same. So this is a great, hilarious photo of her taken in her studio amongst her models. So speaking of amazing optical mixture and playing around with color variety, but just the repetition and the pattern of this dash sort of mark making. Again, these are all oil paintings. Gorgeous color range. They have a figural feel to them, yet they're predominantly made of, pattern-based color relationships. Thinking about value, light. Such a weird one. She does really often very beautiful complementary color relationships. This like soft blue and orange combo. Another artist who deals with pattern in a very different way is Paul Anthony Smith. He's actually quite young, Brooklyn-based photographer. His work deals with his childhood growing up in Jamaica and the African diaspora broadly. He takes photographs and he'll often take them or find them, and then he uses this technique where he actually picks away at the photograph to create a pattern overlaid on top. Oftentimes these patterns relate to either architecture or sometimes they relate to structures like fencing that create barriers between people. But this is an interesting way to manipulate a photograph to overlay a pattern. Like you might have seen this pattern in the past that's often used for like concrete wall structures. This is a photo of him in his studio. Some of these are quite large, you can see. So all of the sort of hazy white or grayish looking patterns over top are actually picked away. He uses a small tool and picks away at the surface. Smith's practice celebrates the rich and complex histories of the post-colonial Caribbean and its people. Memory, migration, and home are central to Smith's work, which probes questions of hybrid identities between worlds old and new. Smith's layered picotage, that's the name for this picking process, is often patterned in the style of Caribbean breeze block fences and modernist architectural elements that function as veils, meant to both obscure and to protect Smith's subjects from an external gaze. While photography typically functions in a way in which to reveal and share information, Smith's picotage has a concealing and purposefully perplexing effect, forcing these nuanced diasporic cultures into a singular picture plane. Smith encourages layers of unease within these outwardly jovial portraits. Picotage serves as an access point as Smith interrogates which elements of identity are allowed to pass through these complexities of borders and migration. Amidst tensions and misidentifying gazes remains the power of community assembly, a reminder of the Jamaican coat of arms, which reads, "Out of many, one people." And that got cut off, but it should say Jack Shaman Gallery, which is where he exhibits his work in New York City. And last but not least is an artist who we've kind of had a brief introduction with, but Anuka Faruque. She's an artist who teaches at Yale. I showed you guys a clip of one of her videos when we talked about Albers, because she's one of the experts of Albers. But she's been making this work recently that is very much about optical mixture, honestly, where she's playing around with using a more limited sort of CYMK, like cyan, magenta, yellow palette, and then doing these like pulls where she's actually physically creating marks in the paint. So they're very textural, even though it's a little hard to see in this image. And she plays around with this idea of what's called color spreading, where you can actually create the illusion of additional colors through optical mixture by overlaying lines in a particular way that allows certain colors to shift in dominance and create new pattern sort of mixing possibilities. So typically with these works, she's only really including 3 mixing primaries like cyan, magenta, and yellow, and white. And so then she's doing some underpainting with these, and then in this case, like putting a layer of generally white paint over top, but creating a grid through the texture. So she's actually using a tool that's like digging in and creating these cylinders that you're kind of seeing subtly. I think this one has actually concentric circles from the center and then some from the top and the bottom and possibly even the sides. Yeah. And so this sort of scraping act allows some of the color underneath to show through and to optically mix in these various ways. These in person actually change in color depending on the angle. So as you move around them, the color mixes, the optical mixing occurs in different ways. That makes the painting look like it's like changing or morphing, like a hologram or something. So you can see here, there's some underpainting, but some of that color variation is due to color spreading and optical mix. So I showed you guys this video when we talked about Albers, but there's one section where she actually talks about optical mix in her work, and I wanted to just refresh your memory with it. I think it's right around.
Color is very experiential objects to people. In terms of the work that I do, the more recent work, I've been dealing actually with fewer colors and reducing my palette. So this is actually just cyan, magenta, yellow, and there's white. And then I'm also getting more colors through the optical color mixing of the relationships, when a magenta is next to a cyan, because these are modular and they're small, from a distance your eye will sort of see a purple, basically. Is truth in the
one of her paintings there. So she's a great example of this sort of optical mixture and color spreading, which we're just kind of getting introduced to, but this very engaging work that talks about the ways that colors optically mix within our eyes, but also the way that patterns, repetitious lines in this case, can create the illusion of optical mix. So on to discuss our assignment.